Despite various phases of confrontation and accommodation between China and ASEAN, strong economic ties have brought enormous prosperity to both sides. However, territorial disputes and China's increasingly assertive economic and diplomatic push into the region are likely to test the durability of the status quo. This panel will examine the long-term ambitions of China towards ASEAN countries and how ASEAN and its members are likely to respond.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the China-ASEAN panel, and thank you for rushing back from your networking lunches. I hope everyone had a good time at those. My name is Greer Meisels, and I am kind of dual-hatted at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., as well as with the Center for the National Interest, which is also in D.C. They're both think tanks. And first of all, I wanted to, of course, offer my thanks to the Asan Institute for putting together a wonderful plenum, and also really for putting together a wonderful panel. I've worked with or know or are just meeting everyone on this panel, so it's a real pleasure for me. I'll give some kind of brief introductory remarks and then brief introductions of the panel, and then we'll begin, since I know you all didn't come here to listen to me speak, but to listen to our excellent panelists. A couple of things to keep in mind, I guess. The theme of this year's plenum is the New World Disorder, and it's interesting because at this session, there's obviously other panels going on, one of which is a panel on maritime security. One is sources of instability in East Asia, and of course now is the China and ASEAN panel. And as I'm sure you can see, there's potentially a lot of overlap in the discussions amongst all three panels. But actually, I think that Asan did us a real service by kind of teasing out this China and ASEAN panel as a separate issue, because there really there's a lot more to the relationship between China and the countries of ASEAN besides just the maritime security issues and some of the territorial disputes that really seem to grab the attention of our headlines. So I think that hopefully this panel will give us an opportunity to look at some of those a little bit more broadly speaking. Additionally, something to keep in mind, and I'm sure our panelists will also do this, is that ASEAN is not monolithic. We talk about ASEAN, we talk about countries of Southeast Asia, and how these countries really relate to China are therefore not uniform. Each country has a different sort of relationship to China, and, for example, the current dynamics between, say, the Philippines and China and Vietnam and China are very different than those from, say, a Cambodia or Burma, so, something else to keep in mind. And finally, as obviously the video at the beginning began to get into, China's policy and China's actions vis-a-vis ASEAN have evolved over time. In the 1990s and early 2000s, it was really the beginning of China's good neighbor policy, promoting closer economic integration between China and the countries of Southeast Asia, and calming some of those territorial disputes. But starting in 2009, there's really been what some people have said is a trend of increased assertiveness on the part of China, and perhaps a growing uneasiness about what China's ambitions are for the region. So I'm sure some of those issues will also come out. So I'll kind of leave my opening remarks at that, and then just do some brief introductions. Immediately to my left, and I guess your right, is Dr. Satu Limaye. Dr. Limaye is the director of the East-West Center in Washington. He was a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis and an editor of the journal Global Asia. And he's also on the International Advisory Council of the Journal of Contemporary Southeast Asia. So very pleased to have Dr. Limaye. And next to him is Lieutenant Colonel Liu Lin. Lieutenant Colonel Liu is an associate research fellow in the PLA Academy of Military Science. And she has also been working in the Asia-Pacific office of the Department of Foreign Military Studies of AMS since 2001. She's also been a visiting fellow in Sweden, and she and I had the opportunity to meet for the first time 5 or 6 years ago in Japan at a trilateral security conference, so it's great to see her here again. Next to her is Mr. Francesco Mancini. Mr. Mancini is currently the Senior Director of Research at the International Peace Institute, which is located in New York, and is an Adjunct Associate Professor at Columbia University School of International and Political Affairs. He also served as an associate at the East-West Institute in New York. He is very prolific these days, and his most recent publication is in a special issue of International Peacekeeping titled Partnership, A New Horizon for Peacekeeping. And Mr. Mancini and I actually also used to work together in New York at the International Peace Institute, and so this is like a coming home for me. And finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Nguyen Hung Son. Mr. Nguyen is a Deputy Director General of the Institute for Southeast Asia and East Asia Studies at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, which is really one of the premier think tanks and research institutions in Vietnam. He was a full-time diplomat, serving as the Director of Political Affairs Division in the ASEAN Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so he will give us really some excellent insight. And he was also a member of the Vietnam High-Level Task Force Delegation negotiating the ASEAN Charter. So with that, we will begin the presentations. I'm going to try to keep all of my panelists to about 5 to 7 minutes for opening remarks so that we have some time for a discussion and to engage with the audience. So I'll be a little bit strict on time, but I will try not to be too much of a taskmaster. So, Satu.
Thank you very much, Greer, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you to the Asan Institute for inviting me to join you today. We have a terrific panel. We have someone from China and someone from Vietnam, and unfortunately our Indonesian colleague couldn't be here. So I think as the American on the panel, maybe I'll just focus more of my remarks not explaining Chinese behavior, which probably shouldn't come from me, but say something about ASEAN and the U.S. opportunities and constraints there, and how this fits into the pattern of China-ASEAN relations. I think it's fair to say that China's relations with Southeast Asia have worsened considerably over the last 3 to 4 years. We can go into great details in the discussion about who's responsible for this, tit for tat, who initiated, who's responding, where do we go from here. I guess my own sense is there are two questions. Can it be fixed, and will they get worse? My own assessment is that these differences between China and ASEAN on the maritime issues are not going to get fixed quickly. There's always a possibility of miscalculation or inadvertent conflict, but I sense there's also some room for management, though none of this is going to happen quite quickly. China's stakes are massive. Not only is it adjacent, this region, to its own territory, but it prevents U.S. dominance in the sea lanes. There's natural resource issues, there's sovereignty issues, there's nationalism issues. But I think from an American perspective, there are sort of two sets of issues. One is ASEAN's future as a unit, and second, our policy in the region. And on coherence, it is quite clear that the differences with China on maritime issues have created problems for ASEAN unity. That's obvious to us. We all know the story and the narrative about last year's summit and the failure for the first time in its history to issue a statement at the end of its ASEAN meetings. That's fine. I would suggest to you that there are 4 other maybe more structural problems with ASEAN unity and coherence going beyond just the differences on China. The first is that the South China Sea issues, and in fact relations with Southeast Asia, are now becoming internationalized in a way that they haven't been internationalized in a generation. So we now have new players like India, Korea, Japan, and others being part of a larger dynamic of Asia-Pacific affairs in which Southeast Asia sits. And therefore it has internationalized the relationships in the region and of the region to a broader international environment. This makes cohesion and unity difficult beyond the South China Sea issue. A second reason for cohesion and unity problems is what I call strategic exposure. Because of the internationalization, Southeast Asia's strategic and foreign policy and diplomatic equities have been exposed. And like any country, they have multiple interests, sometimes overlapping, sometimes competing, changing in dynamics. And that strategic exposure has made it difficult for them to unify their interests. The third is the limits of coherence within Southeast Asia itself. After all, the Southeast Asian project is based on a kind of very interesting calculation, which is sufficient unity and cohesion to attract attention as a central player in the region and to make a case for being a unitary actor, but purposefully insufficient institutionalization to make sure that national prerogatives are not undermined, that national sovereignty is not given up. This carefully and deliberately articulated balance structurally inhibits Southeast Asia from being a unitary actor. Not least, of course, is the change in generational leadership in the region. The original founders of ASEAN, the towering figures who kept it through thick and thin, we are now seeing very different dynamics, and in the next panel, which I'm supposed to be on democracies in Southeast Asia, we'll have something to say about the nature of generational and leadership succession. So this also inhibits Southeast Asian unity. And finally, what I call multiple multilateralisms. Southeast Asia is one core multilateralism in the region, but it's no longer the only one, or perhaps even the most important one. And because of that, Southeast Asian issues like maritime issues, like security cooperation, like diplomatic issues, are now being undertaken not only through the ASEAN mechanism, but also through mechanisms like EAS, the Extended Maritime Forum, and on, ADMM plus, et cetera, et cetera. So these four issues, I think, lead to a structural question about ASEAN coherence and unity beyond the very clear and well-known one of disunity caused by differences regarding the maritime issues. What does this mean for the U.S.? And I'll end. For the United States, I would say that Southeast Asia represents, next to the inclusion of India in our rebalance or our pivot policy, the most innovative element of our overall strategic approach to Asia. This is a generational change. For the first time in a generation, the United States has been involved with all 10 ASEAN countries. Particularly, as you well know, our equities largely lie in maritime Southeast Asia. But with President Obama's re-election, his first trip was to Burma, Thailand, and Cambodia. This is quite a remarkable thing if you think in generational terms, that we are now engaged with every country in Southeast Asia, both mainland and maritime. For the U.S., ASEAN unity and coherence is part and parcel of our strategic approach to the region. This also marks a change in our historical approach, in the sense that we now are looking for integration and cohesion in ASEAN in order for it to address in part the shifting balance of power in Asia. And finally, I'll say that there's a very strong demand side in the region for a U.S. presence, not least because of the differences with China on maritime issues and other issues. So what are the opportunities? I think there are two. For the United States, every Southeast Asian country now looks for us for association, external validation, and participation. But let me be very clear, not alignment. There are treaty allies, like Thailand and the Philippines, but even those treaty allies will not be fully aligned on all issues at all times with the United States. And the second is that countries in the region, for the first time, are looking beyond bilateral relationships with the U.S. and seek to get integrated into more multilateral, networked U.S. security and alliance arrangements. This is happening systematically and slowly, but it is beginning to happen. Let me end with constraints. I think there are three constraints for the United States, and they can be put under the basic theme of appetite in the region versus bandwidth or capacity in the region. There is considerable appetite, as I said, for the U.S. role in the region, but there is also a limit of capacity in the region to play the kinds of roles that the U.S. would like, whether it's on interoperability or exercises or what have you. There are three other divides that we should be cautious of as we deal with Southeast Asia. First, public versus elite differences will always govern how far countries in the region can go with the U.S. Second, domestic consensus over a range of issues that we can talk about in Q&A. And as I said again, historical memories and capacity efforts. So in that sense, we have both opportunities and challenges in terms of constraints in terms of the U.S. role. But overall, for the first time, I think in a very long time, the United States has a pretty fundamental and desired role in Southeast Asia not least because of China, but also because of the larger shifts in balance of power in the region.
Great, thank you so much. I think that Satu laid out several interesting points, not the least of which is the issues that go beyond just kind of the China-ASEAN dynamic, how the U.S. fits into it, and the internationalization of South China Sea issues, and of course also looking at some of those constraints that we can get into later. So thank you very much. Lieutenant Colonel Liu.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I feel honored to be invited to the plenum in Seoul. I will talk about the China-ASEAN relationship. Whenever we take up this topic, I think I want to avoid the South China Sea issue because I think I will be the target. But I still, in my talks, I still talk a lot about this issue because I think it's unavoidable. I want to present some of my own views about this issue. In the past 2 decades, we all know that China-ASEAN relations has made abundant achievements. The mutual economic dependence between China and ASEAN has reached an unprecedented high level, and the political, diplomatic, and even security relations are also expanding continuously. However, I think there are two main factors that may influence the positive development of China-ASEAN relations. First one is the South China Sea issue. The influence of this issue, I think, is represented in 3 aspects. First, it reduces the mutual trust between China and ASEAN. Although there are internal divisions among ASEAN countries on this issue, but I think a more distinct trend nowadays is that ASEAN may be kidnapped by some claimant states to speak with one voice on the issue and to discuss the issue under the ASEAN framework. This position contradicted China's consistent stance, that is, the South China Sea issue is not an issue between China and ASEAN. In fact, ASEAN's more involvement has made this issue become more complicated, I think. The second influence is that in the past 2 decades, the armed forces of ASEAN countries, including the claimant states, are actively pursuing military modernization programs. Although there are many factors driving this process, but I think to prepare for the potential conflict with China in the South China Sea is certainly among one of them. And third is that although it is maybe unlikely to see a major warfare in this area, however, because of the increasing importance of marine resources to economic development and the rising nationalism, the claimant states all enhanced their actual presence in the South China Sea, and the competition for sovereignty and jurisdiction rights have become greatly intensified. So, in the future, frictions, crises, or even small-scale conflicts may break out more frequently. The second factor that may bring negative influence to China-ASEAN relationship, I think, is the U.S. pivot to Asia. One important element of this U.S. policy is the more focus on Southeast Asia. I think now the U.S. has increased its presence in South China Sea, in Southeast Asia greatly, not only in the military field, but also in economic and diplomatic field. So this, the U.S. support and the U.S. enhanced presence has made some claimant states to be much bolder in pursuing its unilateral interest in South China Sea. Besides, it has created a situation in which, while the ASEAN countries want to forge closer economic relations with China, however, they are leaning more toward the United States in security field. So that's the general status of China-ASEAN relationship. Next, I want to provide some suggestions on how to deal the issue of South China Sea in China-ASEAN relationship. I think although South China Sea issue is quite sensitive in China-ASEAN relationship, it still can be managed. And we still can have a lot of work. We still can do a lot of work to manage the tensions and to enhance, at least to minimize the negative influence of this issue on the China-ASEAN relationship. First, I think both China and ASEAN should take a long-term and future-oriented approach in addressing the dispute. This is because territorial disputes usually have complicated historical, geological, legal, and emotional roots. So only when one appreciates this can we deal it rationally and pragmatically. Moreover, the issue of South China Sea is far from the whole of China-ASEAN relationship. The mainstream of China-ASEAN relations is still strengthening common development and cooperation. So we should hold the mainstream and not to allow the issue to destroy the overall development of China-ASEAN relationship. Second, I think the claimant countries should adhere to the principles set out in the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, that is DOC. In fact, I think that in the past decade after the DOC was signed, the concerned parties, has not adhered to the principles strictly. That's why we now see the tensions rising up. Well, many may say that China is among one of them, but I think that, in fact, China's actions are mainly responsive in nature. Because of the time limit, I will not dwell it in detail. Of course, because of China's sheer big size, when it takes some actions, it will arouse suspicions and worries among the neighboring countries. So maybe China should be more sensitive to the feelings of ASEAN countries, but at the same time, the ASEAN countries should care about China's concerns, such as the internationalization of the issue. The third, I think that China and ASEAN should continue to push for pragmatic functional cooperation in the South China Sea. Although China advocated solving the sovereignty issue of South China Sea through bilateral negotiations, but China does not reject a multilateral approach as a way to address functional problems, such as oil and gas exploration, marine environmental protection, marine scientific research, and search and rescue operations. In this aspect, the second-track mechanisms, such as the workshop of managing potential conflicts in the South China Sea, have done a lot and could continue to play a role. And the governments of relevant countries should also make more efforts in these fields. Lastly, I think that we should adopt and implement the confidence-building measures. Rising tensions and the growing capabilities of regional navies highlight the urgent need to operationalize cooperative CBMs for the South China Sea. In fact, in the 2002 DOC, it has put forward some useful measures that we can take, but unfortunately, the signatories have not made a serious effort to implement these measures. Of course, there are also CBMs that can be pursued outside the DOC framework, such as negotiation of incidents at sea agreements, exercising great transparency on military modernization programs, etc. Because most of these measures are related to military issues, so I think the defense establishment should get more involved in this aspect. the last point is that about China's intentions in this area. I think that China still regards South China Sea, not South China Sea, but Southeast Asia as an important area that China should develop friendly relationship. Or we can put it like this, that China still regards the relationship and the cooperation with Southeast Asian countries as quite important to pursue our strategy of maintaining the strategic opportunity period. Because we think that in order to achieve that strategy, we have to have a very good surrounding environment. So Southeast Asia is quite important in this aspect. So that's all.
Great. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Colonel. Some, again, very interesting points that we can bring up during the Q&A, but, again, the reinforcing nature of the fact that the South China Sea issues and territorial disputes are far from the whole of the U.S. or the China-ASEAN relationship. Also some points about the role of the U.S. and how that might have emboldened certain countries in ASEAN to take certain actions, and also some suggestions on ways forward through some of these issues, both in terms of confidence-building mechanisms, as well as kind of taking some more pragmatic functional approaches, so we can address some of those later. Francesco.
Thank you, Greer. And thanks to Asan for the kind invitation and hospitality. It's a great pleasure to be among such a great group of experts. Since my co-panelists are much closer to the region than I am, I decided to take a broader perspective on this topic and discuss more global trends on regionalism, and then zoom into the Southeast Asia area. Notwithstanding all the risks and challenges that my two predecessors just mentioned, I also would like to take a view that the glass is half full and not only half empty, if you want, in cooperation and integration in Southeast Asia. So let me start with a few remarks on global trends on regionalism. I believe that more regional integration is truly a global trend. There is one major exception, if you want, which is the Middle East, where interstate trade and people movements are still incredibly low. However, even in the Middle East, I would claim that the more surprising outcome of the so-called Arab Spring so far is a revitalized Arab League and Gulf Cooperation Council. In Europe, despite the rise of Eurosceptics, I also think that the forecast of European Union collapse are greatly exaggerated. Latin America has seen a proliferation of regional initiatives in recent years. Central Asia, which has deep-rooted diversities and confrontations among the countries there, is also making progress on cooperation, particularly on certain issues like water, for example. Africa is the most striking example, I believe. Africa Union is more active than ever. ECOWAS is intervening in Mali. The East Africa community has introduced the freedom of movement of people and goods among its members. So Southeast Asia is no exception. ASEAN has evolved incredibly, I think, in the recent years. And even if the 2015 deadline might not be met, the ASEAN economic community is an ambitious step forward toward regionalism in the Southeast Asia. The defense forces from all of ASEAN's, along with other 8 countries, which include also China and US, will hold for the first time a 3-day disaster response drill in Brunei in June, and is also an interesting initiative in fostering confidence building among troops. And the ASEAN political security community blueprint is also moving, despite very slowly. But these processes are extremely complex, and coming from a region and a continent where we've been at war for more than 10 centuries, but we've been able to overcome those deep and rooted contradiction and tensions in the last 60 years, been seen a rather peaceful continent in Europe. I think we can say that there is a way to overcome these differences. So now let me move to my second point: is why is this happening? what are these incentives, particularly for ASEAN, to get together? Well, I believe there are very strong incentives here. First of all, we have to realize that the more China rises, the more ASEAN will have an incentive to get together to counterbalance. A more assertive China will also prompt more integration. And this is, again, is a general trend. I think ASEAN countries are now looking through a lens of balance of power. And traditionally, middle powers' fear of a rising power leads to more integration. First, ASEAN is looking for a common position toward China. And second, they try to get other countries along. The US, of course, has been mentioned, but also other countries like India, for example, with greater Vietnamese-India, for example, cooperation on gas and oil exploration in disputed areas, and Russia and the European Union. So after all, regionalism is generally a response to rising external challenges, and ASEAN, as you all remember, was founded on the premises of balance of power in the 1960s, and the idea that there were concerns of rising communist power in domestic politics. If you might remember what the first NATO Secretary General said in 1949. The NATO goals was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. So alliances are done for a mix of reasons, for domestic reasons, regional reasons, and international reasons. And I think all these premises are here in Southeast Asia. Economically, the total trade of ASEAN grew by almost 17% between 2010 and 2011. And the intra-ASEAN trade increased 15% over the same period. Foreign direct investments also increased by 23% between 2010 and 2011. ASEAN countries, I think, are very aware that the prosperity goes also through integration. And politically, an integrated ASEAN region will have more strength toward the assertive China, as I said before. The South China Sea has been raised already as a big issue, and I agree with that. And of course, the stalemate around the Code of Conduct is a case in point. But despite that, there's been also political progress in terms of alignment in ASEAN. I think the role of Indonesia during the chairmanship 2 years ago has been very clear. There was a clear role during the Thai-Cambodian border conflict, albeit some controversy there. But also on Myanmar, I would claim that on leveraging the chairmanship of ASEAN was an additional incentive for opening up. The Indonesian president has called for strategic trust in the region. This idea that in the long term, you need to build trust on strategic points. And I think that's very much the way to go. So, where are we going? 2009 has been a kind of a watershed year for relationship between China and ASEAN. I think one of the reasons was the international financial crisis. I think that China has realized that she's more powerful than they might thought about it. Has become more self-confident. And clearly China understands the importance of developing new markets and is trying to make ASEAN part of the Chinese economic growth. So on one hand, there is more assertive younger leadership in China, which has been growing in proud nationalism and economic growth. And of course, nationalism is good, but it can be dangerous if pushed to the edge. And I think the more assertive position of China on the South China Sea issues is a proof of this assertiveness and self-confidence. China wants to keep the controversial at the bilateral level, sometimes playing one ASEAN countries against each other, sometimes refusing to internationalize the issue with the involvement of ASEAN or even the UN for what matters. China is also trying to gain time, I believe, and grow military. I mean, in 10 years, China will be much stronger. Now, of course, this is in some way a danger or risk, and so I share some of the concerns that are being raised so far, because this game can push for more arms race and confrontation. On the other hand, I really believe China understands the importance of a stable and peaceful region, and that would allow for more economic growth. The need for resources is essential to Chinese interest, and it can be fulfilled with more cooperation, not less. Overall, I see at least 5 areas of further incentives to cooperate. What is happening in the Middle East? It's clearly radicalizing a lot of the Muslim society across the globe. And I think there is a huge concern of that impact also in this part of the world. As you know, the top 10 Muslim countries are not in the Arab world, are in Asia. And so radicalization and extremism is a joint incentive to cooperate. The second is corruption. It's a big problem across the board in Southeast Asia and in China as well, in a lot of parts of the world, of course, but particularly in this region. And there is a clear advantage in cooperating on that front. Linked to corruption, of course, but also broader, is transnational organized crime, and particularly drug trafficking and people trafficking. That's here another area in which I think there are common incentives to cooperate. Natural disaster relief is another area, and we're seeing already a tendency to use these as a, let's say, easier entry point for cooperation on the military point of view. And finally, mitigation of climate change, environmental degradation, and all those issues where I think there are big major concerns that cut across borders. So I see ultimately a huge range of incentives for more cooperation, notwithstanding all the risks and challenges we just mentioned. Ultimately, to me, much depends on China's attitude. However, I believe that there are strong incentives for this cooperation, and I would close with a note of cautious optimism, because we've seen that rising powers and rebalancing is not only a risk, but can also bring countries together. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Francesco, and thank you for the glasses half full side of things. Also appreciated some of your kind of broader points around the trend of regional integration and some of the issues around rising power theory, as well as coming up with some of those interesting incentives to cooperate. I think it's often very easy for us as we look at these issues to find reasons for conflict, but to actually kind of outline some of these issues, corruption, transnational crime, environmental degradation, and the like, that there are actually, in many ways, greater incentives for China to cooperate with ASEAN than not to. So I appreciate that. And finally, we have Mr. Nguyen. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. At the outset, I'd like to express my gratitude to the ASEAN Institute for inviting me to this very interesting plenum and to this very important and interesting panel. Well, I would start with a note that I think if we think of order as rules, then in East Asia, there are 3 major sources of rules. One from the US, which is basically rules on security. One from China, which is basically economic rules, and one from ASEAN, which is diplomatic rules or community rules. Then, if you have China and ASEAN relations well managed, then you have 2/3 of the rule set, and you have a very good chance to have a very good order in East Asia. Well, that said, I'll have 5 points to make on China-ASEAN relations. First of all, if you look at ASEAN in a long period of time, you will see that ASEAN more often than not align with with China's interest rather than go against it. China knows this very well, and it has been using ASEAN as a defense of its interest. Think about issues like human rights. Think about issues like institutionalization of regional mechanism. ASEAN have always stood to the side of China's and protect its interest. Things like the ARF go about non-traditional security issues rather than security issues, about the East Asia Summit being having a more balanced agenda when we have US and Russia going into the summit, things like that. On various occasions, ASEAN have served as a defender of China's interest, and China knows this very well. And my second point is that China has realized this, and it has made a very successful strategic move to get closer to ASEAN and used ASEAN for its benefit. And that happened in 1997 and 1998 when US was distracted towards other regions and gave a strategic opportunity for China to get closer to ASEAN. And that move by China to get closer to ASEAN started off a period of 10 years, roughly, of what I call a honeymoon period between China and ASEAN. Now, for some reason, when the US is back to the region, China unfortunately made a strategic mistake towards ASEAN. And this is clearly exhibited by its action towards ASEAN in 2012 in Cambodia Championship. I don't think I need to repeat all the events that happened in 2012, but I would argue that all this policy that China implemented towards ASEAN with the pinnacle in 2012 actually worked against China's very own interest, at least on 3 counts. China wanted ASEAN to keep silent on the South China Sea issue. Well, you might have silenced it from an ASEAN joint communique, but the sound of silence, I would call it, was actually much louder. Everybody speaks about its absence in the ASEAN's joint communique. So that works against China's interest. Now, China wanted to dissipate China's threat theory in the region, but by the actions that China did to ASEAN actually reinforces ASEAN member states need not to be convinced anymore of China's threat towards the region and towards ASEAN. And thirdly, China wanted to push the US away, to deny access of the US in the region, but by having some sort of hostile policy towards ASEAN, it has opened the way for the very US involvement in the region. So on those 3 counts, I think China's have made a strategic mistake by its recent policy towards ASEAN. Now, what about ASEAN's policy towards the US? I think, yes, we have to admit that there are differences between ASEAN countries, and there are differences even within each ASEAN countries on how to approach towards the Chinese. So that's not surprising at all. There are differences between calculations between short-term economic interest and long-term geopolitical interest. There's difference between how to approach towards the Chinese, whether we use quiet diplomacy, as in the case of Malaysia, or mixed multi-channel diplomacy, as in the case of Vietnam, or go into an open legal battle, as in the case of Philippines. So there are differences on how to approach towards the Chinese. And also there's differences between whether to go informal, for example, on the issue of the South China Sea, or whether to go for more institutional kind of approach, like having more like binding code of conduct on the South China Sea. So there's differences in there. However, I would like to stress the point that the differences within ASEAN is narrowed by the fact that China is becoming more assertive and more hostile towards ASEAN in the region. And this is evidenced by ASEAN various recent statements and resolution to tackle ASEAN or to tackle China as one bloc. So that brings me to the 4th point, which is the question asked by the organizer. Would an US-China confrontation divide ASEAN, or would ASEAN survive a US-China confrontation? I would say that ASEAN would survive that. Because why? ASEAN was born, during the time of major power confrontation, and ASEAN's very own existence is because ASEAN would like to survive that kind of confrontation. Not that ASEAN doesn't fear China-US confrontation, but being fearful of that doesn't mean that ASEAN do not know what to do in such a scenario. ASEAN is determined not to take side when it comes to China-US confrontation. In fact, I would argue that ASEAN would be in a more dangerous position if there was a concert between US and China. In that case, ASEAN would lose relevance and might not know what to do, rather than in a case of confrontation. Now, my last point is on the South China Sea. This is clearly, you can't avoid it. It's still an issue not only between ASEAN and China, but also in a broader region. The critical issue here is the strategic mistrust that exists between ASEAN and China. China thinks that ASEAN is inviting US to meddle into the region to encourage, as in the words of Liu Lin, to encourage member states to take more assertive or to do some actions that China perceives as a threat to its interest. Whereas ASEAN thinks that China is not going to rise peacefully. China has a more hegemonic intention in the region, and this is evidenced by its recent assertive activities. So there's mistrust there in the region, and the mistrust is spiraling, and it's inviting action and counter-reactions in the region. So it's critical that China and ASEAN and the US, as well as other countries in the region, work together to dissipate this spiraling mistrust that is evolving. Now, second point is, once we have the confidence in the region, it's critical that countries in the region implement the Declaration of Conduct on the South China Sea. The point here, which was made by Liu Lin, is that China thinks that certain ASEAN member states act against the principle of the DOC, whereas countries in the region thinks otherwise, thinks that China is the country which is to blame by its less than restrained activities in the South China Sea. Well, I would suggest that having finger pointing isn't useful to the situation in the South China Sea. Why doesn't China and ASEAN sit back and review the implementation of the DOC and see what kind of action from each side which is not helpful or unhelpful to the atmosphere in the South China Sea? And why don't move one step further by embarking on the negotiation on a more substantial, more detailed, and more binding code of conduct on the South China Sea? Well, ASEAN has been showing its readiness towards China onto negotiating a code of conduct. Unfortunately, for some reason, China is still thinking that condition isn't ripe yet for such a negotiation. I finally would like to say that if China think about it, had there been a COC, a code of conduct, would there be enough incentive for the Philippines to go into an arbitration against China in the international court? I would think that there will be a lot less incentive for the Philippines to do so. Well, my conclusion is that if China can rethink its policy towards North Korea under a very new context, why doesn't China try to rethink its strategy towards the South China Sea? After all, does China really needs a maritime buffer zone that much in the new context? After all, does China really fear a maritime blockade, or World War II type of maritime blockade that much in the context of globalization these days? And if some certain country thinks that they might want to blockade China, do you think that countries in the region would support such a move? If China thinks so, maybe China will realize that a more forward-looking and more cooperative approach with ASEAN on the South China Sea might be a lot better for regional order than the situation it is today. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and some very interesting points, and your last analogy that if China can begin to do a rethink on its DPRK policy, perhaps it can do a rethink on some of its actions in South China Sea, but also some other very excellent points that were brought up, specifically the idea that, countries of ASEAN don't want to take any sides between a dispute between U.S. and China, and the fact that ASEAN would survive, a potential U.S.-China confrontation. At this point, I'm going to open it up to the floor. I would ask that you raise your hand and introduce yourself, and then, all questions, comments are welcome, as long as they are kept relatively short so that we have ample time for discussion. And so with that, I will open it up.
Thank you very much for coming to the Korea, first of all. My name is Seung-hee Hong. I'm from the Asan Institute, but I'm a new person, so my question is to the Professor Mancini and the Professor Lin, because I have several questions. Unlike your opinion, ASEAN members' military modernization and increased expenses, and U.S. pivot Asia are more likely to influence by the China's growth power, reobtaining the regional power from the U.S. Therefore, the other neighboring countries more concerned about China's increased military power, even maritime conflict in the Southeast Asia, and what do you think about it? And also to Professor Mancini, what are the UN mediation department are doing to stop the South Asia maritime conflict among the ASEAN members?
Okay. Yes, thank you for your question. As to China's military modernization, I think that the purpose of our military modernization is mainly for protecting our expanding interests, especially the maritime interests. The nature of our defense strategy has not changed. We still hold on to the defensive strategy, which means that we will not take aggressive actions in South China Sea. Although we have ended some advanced equipments, especially Navy and Air Force equipments, but I think for such a big country like China, it's quite normal that when you are rising, when your interests are expanding, it's quite natural that you should enhance your military capability to cope with the expanding challenges and the interests. So I think that maybe I also don't think that the Southeast Asian country military modernization is solely targeted at the South China Sea issue. In fact, there are many factors behind. For example, they also have to enhance their capability to protect their interests in the EEZ and the continental shelf, and also to deal with the transnational threats and things like that. So there are many factors behind the military modernization programs. Yeah.
Francesco, if you want to address.
Sure, very briefly. The UN Department of Political Affairs is following the issue, and the Department of Southeast Asia is very closely following. As of now, I don't see a particular role for the UN. As you know, the UN is whatever its member states want to do with it. So it's really up to the parties to decide if they want an engagement of the UN. Potentially, I think the UN can offer an interesting place, a forum for conversation. But as of now, that is not happening.
I see several questions, 1, 2, 3, 4, so if there are mics, that can... There's 2 up here and 2 over there, if someone had a mic.
Hi, I'm Nguyen from Seoul National. It's somewhat surprising to see that nobody mentioned Japan. The reason was something like economic background for Japan, but now it is now threatened by rise of China. So I think we should mention discuss about Japan, maybe from the position of China or from US, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Satu.
Sure. In fact, we have a project on Japan, US, and Southeast Asia. I think it's, as you well know, Japan has been engaged since post-war, particularly since the mid-'70s with Southeast Asia. In recent years, particularly the last year or so, the first visit of the new Prime Minister was to Southeast Asia. It's clear that Japan is seeking more opportunities to be engaged in the region, something the U.S. Certainly welcomes, both on aid, maritime capacity building, more cooperation and exchanges on issues like maritime piracy, maritime security. Japan has been very active in pushing forward an extended maritime forum in the region. So it's clear Japan has interest as a trading nation, as a nation that gets its energy supplies. I think that's quite natural. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, one of the elements of Southeast Asia is that Southeast Asia is not just a U.S.-China issue anymore. Many countries have a stake in the region, and certainly Japan is one of them.
There was a question next to him.
Hi, Mark Mannion from the Congressional Research Service. Actually, following on Professor Kunhi's remark and yours, Satu, about the internationalization of Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, I'm just wondering, it seems to me that the South China Sea issue and the Senkaku Diaoyutai issue have become linked in that people now are, in both regions, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, are watching the outcomes of various tensions there. So I'm wondering if all of you on the panel could, or many of you could discuss how that linkage is changing the dynamics at all, about how various countries are acting.
I don't know who wants to approach that first, the idea of, kind of using one as a litmus test for the other and vice versa. So, I don't know. Mr. Nguyen?
Okay, sure. Right. Well, I think, yes, they are certainly linked. And to the Chinese, probably they are one issue rather than linked, because they both see the U.S. behind the Senkaku and the South China Sea. Well, but in other aspects, I think there are similarities between issues, on the South China Sea and the Senkaku or Diaoyu islands as well, and that is on the application of international law, how you go about resolving a territorial disputes. It's very much an issue of whether or not one should use its sheer power to assert its will over a competing claim on a completing territory, or whether you should go about using dialogue or peaceful means to resolve it. So I think there are issues of enforcing international law here, the application of and interpretation of international law, like the United Nations Law of the Sea here. So they are very much similar and linked issues which shouldn't be separated when countries in the region look at the issue holistically.
Lieutenant Colonel Liu, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
I maybe provide some of my own insights on this issue. I think that we have noticed that the Southeast Asian countries and Japan have enhanced their coordination on maritime issues, especially between Japan and the Philippines and Japan and Vietnam. I think the main factor is the China factor. Is maybe they think that they can join hands to deal with China's positions in this issue. However, I think that there are some differences between these two maritime disputes, because the China-Japan dispute, I think it's is a dispute between two big powers in East Asia, and the U.S. has made its commitment to the mutual defense treaty between between Japan and the U.S. clearly. So the U.S. involvement is very clear in this issue. And it's also an issue between two big powers. So for China, we think that this issue is more urgent and more complicated to handle. But as to the South China Sea issue, we think that it's an issue between China and some small and medium-sized countries. And also we have very good relations with ASEAN countries. So we want to, we have more patience in dealing with this South China Sea issue. Yeah, that's my opinion.
And Satu, you had a comment?
Yeah, Mark, thanks. I don't think they're very easily conflated. I think the more one digs into the South China Sea versus the East China Sea issue, the more differences I tend to find. But I think there are four core issues that affect both. First is what our Vietnamese colleague Asan referenced, which was norms, is what norms will be used to adjudicate, settle, manage the disputes. That means non-use of force, international legal norms, negotiation, etc., which have some applicability to both areas. The second is standing. While you may look for norms in both, South China Sea claimant countries do not have standing in East China Sea disputes, and parties to the East China Sea disputes do not have standing in South China Sea disputes. They do not have any territorial claim. They do not have any maritime claim other than global norms such as freedom of navigation, which would come under point 1 about norms. Where you get away from norms and legal issues like legal standing in these disputes where you don't have any particular claims are, I think, two geopolitical issues. One is the rise of China. And for both East China Sea and for South China Sea, the test, if you will, is how will China behave as it rises in power? And will it seek to make claims like the 9 dash lines in South China Sea? Will it seek to alter the status quo of administrative control on the Senkakus, Diaoyutai, those kinds of issues? And also it has implications for us in the United States, because for many countries, and this is common in both cases, it's really a test or a question of reliability and reassurance of the United States' role in the region. And since at least 2 of the countries in South China Sea are U.S. treaty allies, and if not, emerging partnerships or however you want to label them, and clearly in 2 cases in East China Sea, both ROK and Japan are treaty allies. It has enormous implications, I think, for testing reassurance and reliability. And there are, of course, other cases. These aren't unique. The Korean Peninsula issues have reassurance reliability issues as well, as you well know. But I think that's how I would frame it, rather than these are similar types of disputes. Because as I say, more you dig into this, the more differences, at least I find, in the nature of the disputes. But these are 4 things that would bring them as a way of thinking about their handling.
Great. Francesco, did you have anything
else?
Just
1 minute. I totally agree with Satu that the 2 issues should not be conflated. At the same time, we're not operating in the vacuum here. I mean, there are norms and international standards on these kind of issues that I think are important to be taken into consideration. So, to this extent, I see the links that were mentioned before. Thinking about the role of international organizations and international law in this area, the United Nations can be useful in facilitating the conversation here. There are precedents around the world that, of disputes, territorial disputes, for example, in Africa, the Bakassi Peninsula between Cameroon and Nigeria, for example, in Latin America, between Ecuador and Peru, which have been addressed and has been solved, if not almost solved, in the case of Nigeria and Cameroon. So I think there is an international element to be taken into consideration. However, what Liu Ling was saying before, China is patient. And I think this patience is, of course, playing its own advantage. Because, as I mentioned before, if you take a long-term perspective, I think China will have a more contractual power to offer. And so time is playing on China's hands.
Great. There's a question over there.
Firstly, no question, some comments. I find that since 2 years, everywhere when I participate in the conference like this, if we talk about the relation between China and ASEAN or China and Southeast Asia, every time we talk about the negative aspect. It means that the disputes in the South China Sea, etc., etc. I want to say, firstly, relation between China and ASEAN member countries, the dispute is not all. We have many cooperation. For example, for the CAFTA, many the cooperation in the trade, economic cooperation, cultural, etc., etc. And I must say, firstly, the relationship between China and ASEAN is not so bad as we think. Secondly, the problem exists, the disputes exist, is a fact. But we must also think that the disputes has a very long historical factors. It's not a new thing. And it's not easy to find a solution. We cannot have a dream to find a solution tomorrow morning. It's not possible. And in this case, we must talk about the conflicts and disputes, etc., and try to find some factors, etc. But it's not all. We must talk also the positive aspects of the relation between China and ASEAN. Firstly. Secondly, I want to say that for the Chinese policy vis-à-vis to the East Asia, including Southeast Asia, is an opening policy. It's not excuse some other countries, even USA. Why? You can find that when we talk about the establishment of a new institution of the cooperation summit of East Asia, at the beginning, China have an idea to in the basis of the 10+3. But for some countries of ASEAN, they prefer to have enlargement, and we accepted that some new members. And we can find for the first summit of the East Asia is 10+3 and 3. Australia, India, New Zealand. And after there are two new members, USA and Russia. It means that this is, and for every country of the member country of the ASEAN is an independent country. He can establish the relation with other countries, no problem. For example, with the USA, etc. But it's not with to a third party, especially to China. Because I think that for the modern international relations, we must have an idea to keep the stability and the development of the region. Third, I think for the China and the ASEAN members, there are some disputes, etc., but this is the government's levels. For the people levels, I think today, with the development of the information system like the internet, etc., and the public opinion play a very important role in the government's policy, foreign policy. And we must try to improve the friendship feeling in the peoples. For I can say that today, when we go to Philippines and even Vietnam, etc., I find that the people are still very kindly vis-à-vis to the Chinese people, etc. There are no problem. But I think that we must do something to stop conflicts in the level of the peoples. And I think this will be useful for the development of relations between China and ASEAN, and also the region. And the last question, just for our colleague Mr. Sun. And you have given some proposal to Chinese government. You must do 1, 2, 3, 4. And now my question is, for keeping of the stability of the region, including the South China Sea, and also for the development of relations between China and ASEAN, what Vietnam must do?
Well, I quite agree with you that the dispute is not everything in China-ASEAN relationship. But at the same time, we cannot use the good part of the dispute to disguise that the problem, to put the problem under the carpet. The problem is there, and what I am advocating is that ASEAN and China has to face it, rather than forget it and sweep it in under the carpet. Well, with regard to your question of what Vietnam can do in order to promote ASEAN and China relationship, as well as to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea. I think my proposal was clear in my presentation, is that ASEAN and China need to have a frank dialogue on the implementation of the DOC. The DOC has laid out principles which both sides accuse the other side of violating. So why don't we sit down and review the actions taken by each side and see which are the actions that is violating the DOC, which are the action which is not restrained, which is not showing restraint in the South China Sea. And secondly, ASEAN and China needs to move forward with a code of conduct, because the code of conduct is going to fix the problem which with the DOC, that the deficiency of the DOC, which is not helping the situation in the South China Sea. So, well, this is not only the wish of Vietnam or ASEAN, but I believe it's also a wish of the international community for that ASEAN and China can work together and, on such an arrangement.
Just very quickly, I received the 5-minute warning about 2 minutes ago, so I wanted to see if there were any other questions in the audience so I could try to collect those very quickly. Yes. And is any others? All right, we'll have that as the last question and then give you all a chance to make some final remarks.
Well, it is a sort of wrap-up question, really, which is to ask the panel to respond to Mr. Son's remark in his presentation that the way China had behaved over the South China Sea in Phnom Penh last year was counterproductive to its own interests, or whether, in fact, China achieved not just a short-term diplomatic goal, but a sort of long-term point of showing that a weak ASEAN can be manipulated to its ends, and that for all its professed support for ASEAN and ASEAN centrality, that is really China's interest. Thank you.
Well, I think it was a Chinese leader, maybe it was Mao, who said, when asked about what he thought about the French Revolution, said it was too early to tell. And I think it's a little too early to tell whether China's relations with neighboring countries that's surrounded by land or by sea on the basis of one summit portends the future of China-Southeast Asia relations. China-Southeast Asian relations aren't going to go away. It is very clear to me, and maybe through my own assessment, that the last 3-4 years have not been good for China's image or relations with Southeast Asia. They have not been all bad, but they clearly have not been good. Now, the question you raise is a fundamental one, is China interested in ASEAN coherence? Is China interested in ASEAN unity? Of course China is interested in relations with its neighbors, with the 10 countries that comprise this association. You know, many in the US, I think, many non-Chinese observers would say that China has sought to undermine ASEAN, to break ASEAN up. I think it's an interesting question. My own assessment is a little bit different. I don't believe that China begins its premise of relations with Southeast Asia as requiring ASEAN unity and coherence. They do not seek ASEAN unity and coherence as a balance of power tool. They do not seek ASEAN unity and coherence for integration. They want Southeast Asian integration with the Chinese economy. They don't necessarily need the integration amongst ASEAN. I think the US and others approach this differently. It's in our interest to see ASEAN coherence and unity, not only in balance and powers terms, but integration terms as a platform for US businesses and commerce. It makes more sense for us. So I think maybe the US and China simply approach the issue of ASEAN unity and coherence differently. And so the idea that somehow China's fully ended its good graces with Southeast Asia because of the 2012 issue, I don't necessarily buy. I think what China has to calculate is the net result of its actions over the last 2-3 years has clearly made more Southeast Asia, as I said in my opening remarks, more desirous and have a higher demand for a U.S. security role, presence, including, and people keep saying this economic, military, or security divide. I don't buy it. I think Southeast Asian inclusion in TPP, some members who want to join TPP, others who want good relations with the U.S., do want both economic and security relations with the U.S.
I received the please end sign, but I'm going to allow the other panelists to have just a couple of very final thoughts, final point, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. As to China's attitude toward ASEAN's cohesion, integration, I think that China has made it quite clearly that China supports ASEAN's integration. I think this is mainly because that, first, ASEAN's integration is something that China cannot control. It's something that ASEAN must pursue out of its own interest. The second is that ASEAN's integration is not ran counter to China's interest, just as my Vietnam colleague has said that many of China's interests, in fact, is allied with ASEAN's interests. If you see the ASEAN's blueprint for political and security community, many of the principles, such as non-interference and in international in other countries' affairs and something like that, is similar to China's principles. So I think that China quite supports the ASEAN's integration. Besides, another reason that is ASEAN. If ASEAN becomes stronger, I think that it will it will secure its position as the driver of the broader regional integration process, which I think is conforming to China's interests. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, I think I tried at the beginning to inject a little bit of cautious optimism, and I stick with that, frankly. I do agree with Satu that the economic, military, security issues, you can't really take them apart. However, I think it's going to be a natural trend that the economic part will move faster than the political and military, which of course are the more complex. So I think there is going to be a drive to an economic integration, which, as Yulin just mentioned, is also in the Chinese interest. It's simply going to get much easier, to interact with a sort of joint player on the other side. I mentioned a few factors that can drive interest of cooperation across the board, but I think the sign that things are changing, and not necessarily only in a negative way, is that today in a conference like this we do have a panel on ASEAN. I think 6 years ago we would not have a panel on ASEAN because there was not much to say about it. Mm-hmm. So I think it is a sign that actually things are evolving and not only in a negative way.
Well, to answer the question, if China wanted ASEAN unity and solidarity, well, if China didn't want that, they wouldn't have invested so much on ASEAN, on its charm offensive 10 years ago, just to achieve so much improvement in China's standing in the eye of ASEAN member states. So I think China does need it. It's just that it has made some miscalculation, probably from misperception of what ASEAN is doing, or misperception of its power vis-à-vis ASEAN and the US in the region. So I think I'll end with an optimistic note that we have a new set of people in Beijing, a new foreign minister who is very region-friendly, and we just hope that all these new faces, new vision will review China's policy towards the region, and we hope that China will come up with a more friendly and cooperative attitude towards regional countries.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and ending on a couple of optimistic notes, which is always nice. So if you could please join me in thanking our panelists.